All right, welcome to the third lesson. We are going to talk today about vital records and census records. We will be taking a better look at what information you can find in vital records and census records and how to use them as a tool to learn more about your ancestors and to find new names and expand your tree. We'll begin with vital records. Vital records, they record the vital events in anyone's life. So if you think about the vital events of someone's life, the most important things to happen to them, that would be their birth, marriage, and death. So vital records are birth, marriage, and death records. And they are taken, we'll focus on vital records today in the United States especially, but the practice of recording vital statistics began pretty slowly here in the United States, and it varies really greatly depending on the state. So early birth, marriage, and death record information was pretty rarely recorded. Sometimes it was recorded in what they would call registers, especially in the older states. Some town clerks in colonial America, especially in New England, recorded vital information, but these records are largely incomplete. These records, vital records, are registered with the state, and it's not on a federal level unless an American was born outside of the country and it was recorded in an embassy or a consulate. But those are pretty rare circumstances. That doesn't happen too often. Sometimes privacy laws can affect different states differently. So in Family Search, you may be able to find a birth, marriage, and death record for somebody who lives in Iowa, but you might not be able to find any of those things for somebody who lives in Colorado, just based on that state's privacy laws. Typically, you can expect to see birth records from people who are 100 years old or older, and death records from people who died about 50 years ago or earlier. And that varies, but that's typical. You won't find birth records for people who might still be alive today for the most part. And they try to keep the privacy of people who have died recently. So you won't find a birth record for somebody who was born in the 60s typically. Records of marriages were usually the first vital records to be kept in any given place in the United States because it had to do with property usually. So those records are kept on a county level. So if you are looking for a particular marriage record in a particular place, I encourage you to use the catalog or the research wiki. And the research wiki, we'll go there first. The research wiki is going to tell you anything you need to know about the vital records in any given state and where you can find them and when you can find them. So let's look at Missouri, for example. And you go to the Missouri United States Genealogy page, it has all this good information. And then on the side here, they have record types and they have vital records. So if you click on vital records, it'll tell you all the information they have about the vital records taken in Missouri. So that's the birth, marriages, and deaths. And it'll tell you that the earliest were taken about whenever the county was organized for marriages. Statewide registration started in the 1880s, but it wasn't generally complied with. It wasn't always taken until the 20s. So if you have this information, then you know that it's pretty useless to look for a birth record before the 1880s, and you might not find one until the 1920s. So check out the wiki before you do your vital research so you can know what is even available to you. If you go back to the state page, they also have this little button over here that says Missouri Online Genealogy Records. And if you click on that, it'll sort all of the online records they have for any given place. And it'll tell you with links where to find them. So they have a whole section for births, marriages, and deaths. And as you can see, there are a lot of different places you can find indexes for this place and these types of records. And it'll tell you if you have to pay or if you need a subscription. Most of these are like Ancestry or Find a Grave or Find My Past, things like that, which we luckily have a subscription to if you are a member of the church. So don't let the little dollar sign scare you. It might just be telling you that you need a subscription. That's a great place to look. You can also go to the catalog like we talked about in our second lesson, and you can search by place. So let's go St. Louis, Missouri. And let's say St. Louis County. We want to see all of the vital records. So this is St. Louis County. And remember to look by county, not by city. St. Louis City would be an exception because it kind of acts as its own county. But when you're looking for, let's say, Provo, Utah, you would go to Utah County, not Provo, to be able to find the vital records. So you scroll all down, all the way to the bottom, it has 23 record sets that have to do with vital records. So there's all of these also that you can look at. And some of these are going to be indexed and some of them aren't. So be sure to check out the catalog because there might be some hidden information to expand your tree with. Let's see. The local health departments of a few large cities began recording births and deaths by the mid-1800s. So sometimes you'll be able to have better luck if your ancestor lived in a bigger city, like St. Louis or Boston or Baltimore or New York City. They typically started taking vital records earlier than the state in general. Most counties in the East and Midwest were recording births and deaths by the late 1800s. So that's when you'll have your most success with your ancestors who lived in the United States. Each state eventually developed its own laws and created a statewide registration system. Unfortunately, these records do not exist until the early 1900s in most states. Local offices did not always comply immediately with registration laws, but usually within 20 years after the registration laws were enacted, most states were recording at least 90% of the births and deaths. And you can find all that information about registration laws and when those things were enacted on the Family Search Wiki like we talked about. So now let's go over some tips for using vital records and what they look like. And one of the best tips for doing your family history is to search for a death record first. As long as you know the name and some basic information like where someone was born and what their parents' name is, you should be able to find a death record. And you'll need the married name of a female ancestor, but for the most part, that's all you need is a name and an age or a birth year. And so when you're trying to find vital records for your ancestors, starting with the death record first, it might seem counterintuitive. You want to start with your birth first, but the death record, some of the reasons you might want to start looking for a death record before a birth and marriage is your ancestor's death is more recent in history than his birth or marriage, and it's usually best to work from most recent events backwards, from the known to the unknown. Death records usually tell you where your ancestor last lived, and then you can look for other records for that place. You can look for census records. You can kind of work your way backwards in time, and it's usually easier to do that than the other way around. Death records can lead you to other documents created in connection with the death, such as burial and probate. Those records may give more family information. They can contain birth, marriage, and burial information, so it has a lot of that vital information that you're looking to find can be found in a death record, where as a birth record will only talk about the birth. It won't talk about the marriage and the death because it hasn't happened yet. But death records can contain all of that vital information, which can be really helpful in leading you to those records. Death records exist for many people who were born before birth and marriage records began. So if you have an ancestor who was born in 1820 but died in 1900, the likelihood of them having a birth record is very low, but a death record is very high. And that death record can act as a supplemental birth record, or at least a source for birth information. So I'm going to show you an example of a death record, and this is one from Iowa. And remember what we said in the lesson 2, that it's really important to check the images of all the indexes that you find. So if you find a record and it tells you this person died this place, great. But you're going to want to check that image and get all the information you can, because there's extra information there that isn't going to be indexed, such as cause of death or who informed the information, things like that. So this is a death record for a man in Iowa, and it will tell you the place of death. Most death records will tell you this information, regardless of state. So they'll tell you the place of death, and they'll tell you the full name. They'll usually tell you how long they lived in the area. So let's see, this guy died in 1930, it says right here. So if he lived in this place, Delaware County, Iowa, for 10 years in 1930, we can expect to see him in this town in the 1930 and the 1920 census. That's 10-year span. So that's a good clue into more that points us to more records for this man. It will tell you the gender, the race, and the marital status. So we know he was married, so we know to look for a marriage record, and it usually will tell the name of the spouse. Now, this isn't super useful information. It just says Mrs. David E. Thomas, so it doesn't tell us her name, but we do know that he had a spouse. It tells you the birthday, if it's known, and the age. It can be really precise. Sometimes nobody knows. It'll tell you their occupation, their birthplace, and their birth information about who their parents were. And this piece of information, the informant, is actually really important when you're talking about death records, because it's important to know who gave this information. Is it a neighbor? Is it a child? Is it a brother? Is it a spouse? I think it's safe to say that, like, your children might not know as much as your wife does about your family history or about your own life, and your neighbor definitely doesn't know as much as your family does. So it's important to look at this informant and be aware of who this person is and what their relationship is to the person who died, so you can understand where the information is coming from. So this informant is Mrs. Frank Wilson, which I happen to know is his daughter. And so we can know that she probably knows his birthday and his age really well. And she should know her own mother's name. She just decided to be lazy about it. But she doesn't know a whole lot about her grandparents. But she does know that they were from Wales. So you can trust most of this information that she would have been alive for. So she knows who her mother and father are. She knows the day, his birthday. She knows where he's buried. That kind of stuff. But maybe some of the things like his birthplace or his parents' names, she's not as solid on. So that's a good piece of information to pay attention to. Death records also usually include the burial information. It always defaults to burial. If they were cremated, it will be circled. If they were removed, it just means the body was sent to a different state or a different city or something like that. It'll also say that, and it'll tell you where they're buried or where the body is put. And then it will also tell you the funeral home usually. On the right-hand side, it will tell you the cause of death and the date of death, and it usually has a doctor's signature. It will tell you the cause of death, and it will also have this little number here on the side. And don't just ignore that number. It's actually really useful, especially if you're having a hard time reading the handwriting of a document. Pay attention to the little numbers. So this right here is actually a death certificate code. And these codes you can find if you just Google IDC death record codes. the International Lists of Causes of Death, IDC. And this 1920, if you just Google it, IDC death record codes, it's usually 3 or 4 down, but it has this little 1920 here. It's on wolfbane.com, and it has all of those codes on there. As long as somebody died after 1920, this is what the codes were going to be. And you can just search right there, and this code is 133. And it says he died of a disease of the bladder. And if there's another sub number, it'll tell you more about that. So if I didn't know what acute uremia meant, or if I couldn't read that, that little code is going to tell me more information. So pay attention to the little codes there. And then also on death records, we'll have information if it was a more eventful death, like violence or suicide or an accident, which wasn't the case in this death, but it will include that information. And it will have the signature of the coroner or the doctor and all that good information. So the only things that will typically be indexed on that are the name, the date of death, maybe some of the spouse information, birth date, things like that. But there's all sorts of great information in an image that you might not find in an index. So pay attention to the records and the images and analyze them. Pay attention to what dates and ages are given, what places are mentioned. Are the parents or the spouse named? Are witnesses to the event related to the family? Who provided the information? Was that person someone who knew the family well? Does the death record give the name of the cemetery or funeral home? You might be able to find those records there. Does the information from the record fit with what you know from the family? If it does not fit, then it might have been miscopied or misinterpreted. It might be the wrong person. But check your sources. Let's show an example of a marriage record. Marriage records will typically have the name of the bride and the groom, their ages, what number of marriage they're on. Sometimes it will include the parents of the bride and groom. It'll always include witnesses and where they were married. Sometimes it'll include birthplaces, things like that. So it depends on the state, depends on the time. But again, look at the images and see what you might be able to find. There will usually be a certificate of marriage and an application for a license. Sometimes they're put together, sometimes they're separate, so there might be multiple marriage records for you to be able to find. Just pay attention to the dates and know that this license may have been applied for months before the actual marriage, so this August 9th may or may not be the day of their marriage. And sometimes it is the same day and sometimes it isn't. So just pay attention to what record you're actually looking for. Let's show an example of a birth record and another good example of things that won't be indexed that could be really useful. Most birth records will have the name of the child and it'll have good information about the parents. So if they were a twin or triplet, or if they were legitimate, meaning that the parents were married when the child was born. It'll usually tell you where the parents are from, and it will tell you lots of good information about the mother, of like how many children she's already had, how many children are still living, and that can be good information for finding missing children. So pay attention to all the birth records for the children in a certain family, and you might be able to find more information about how many kids there were in the whole family, things like that. So sometimes you're just not going to be able to find vital records. Some reasons for that might be your ancestor just lived and died in a different place than you're looking for, or they may have used a nickname or a maiden name, or it was misspelled. If you have an ancestor who immigrated to the United States, sometimes the name was anglicized. So Enrique Torres might be Henry Torres in his records in the United States, for example. Or sometimes the record just simply doesn't exist for the time that you're searching in, or they were missed. A lot of times, people just didn't care about going down to the county and recording certain information as much as we do today. So sometimes that's just is what's going to happen, and you're just going to have to find alternate sources to support the information that you're trying to find. Let's talk about censuses now. So a census is a count and description of the population of a country, state, county, or city for any given date. Censuses are used by most governments just to take accounting of who's living in their country. Census lists are also called schedules. And in the United States, a nationwide census has been taken every 10 years since 1790. In fact, we're in the middle of taking a census right now. If you haven't filled out your census, I encourage you to do so because it has a lot of genealogical value, as well as it is a law to do so. But censuses are one of the easiest ways to locate where an ancestor lived and when they lived there. And you can also use censuses to follow the family over time and determine family relationships, or find clues to other locations where the family lived and show clues for finding other records. So even though in the United States we've taken a census every 10 years since 1790, we have a privacy rule that says that you can only view censuses that are 72 years old or older. So the most recent census that we have available to search through is the 1940, and in 2022 we will have access to the 1950 census, but you're not going to find any of the censuses from 1950 to 2010 until 72 years have passed, and that's just because there are plenty of people who are older than 72 years old who may not want to have that information be public, who might be in those censuses. But typically, we will be able to see those censuses after 72 years. And we have all of the censuses from 1790 to 1940 to our disposal. So let's begin with the earliest censuses. We have the 1790 through the 1840 census. This is an 1840 census I have up right here. The 1790 through the 1840 are less useful for finding names. They're mostly just used for tracking a family's location, and that is because they only recorded the head of the household, which is typically the patriarch, the male, the father of the family. Sometimes it was the widow, sometimes it could be a single person, but for the most part, it is the head of household, and it only marks tally marks for the other family members. So you'll also have a lot of record destruction for the population censuses taken before the War of 1812, because there was some record destruction in Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812. So the 1790 and the 1800 census, 1810 census has some record gaps. But there's still some useful information. So let's look at this 1840 census. As you can see, it has the name of the person who is living, the head of the household. So this first person is William H. Alexander, and it will give tally marks or numbers for all of the people in his household. So we have 2 boys between the ages of 5 and 10, a male who is the age of 30 to 40, which is probably William Alexander. And then we have a female who's under the age of 5, and then a female age 30 to 40. So the 30 to 40 are probably William Alexander and his wife, and it looks like they have 3 living children between the ages of 10 and newborn. We don't know what their ages are, but we have 3 young children. If you scroll down, it'll tell you if there are any free colored persons in their family. And it's also important to remember on these earlier censuses that there is a second page. So when you see this page right here, if you click to the next page, it'll continue more information. So you can see that if they had any slaves, you can see the total amount of people in their family, and you can also see what they were employed in. So it looks like the man was a farmer. It'll tell you if somebody served in the Revolutionary War. Now that's only for the 1840 census. And in 1840, the Revolutionary War was about 70 years earlier, so there's not going to be a whole lot of people who are included in this, but if they are, it's really useful information. And it'll also tell you if anybody went to school. So the earlier censuses are not super useful genealogically, but they can help track a family. The next period of time we'll talk about is the 1850 to the 1870 census. This is an 1870 census. These are more useful because it includes all the members of a household and their specific ages, birthplaces, occupations, things like that, but it does not state relationships. So we cannot automatically assume that these people are married or that they are husband or that they are parents to these children, but you can make a pretty good inference based on that. The 1870 census is the first census to list all African Americans by name because it is post-emancipation, post-Civil War. The 1860 census is the last census taken right before the Civil War. So if you have an ancestor who shows up in 1860 but does not show up in 1870, you may want to look for Civil War records, see if they were a casualty of the war. But in general, the 1850 through the 1870 census, they will include the place and the date that the census was taken. It'll also include the name, the description, age, gender, race, occupation, place of birth. It'll also tell you if their parents were born in a different country, if they can read and write, and if they were able to vote, if they were a male over the age of 21. But it's important to look at all of the columns in a census and see what information might be available to you that you didn't know was particularly useful. So let's look at this first guy right here, Victor Post. It says he was 55 at his last birthday. So that means that by August 16th, when this census was taken, Victor was 55 or about that age. He has no occupation, meaning he was either retired or he just didn't want to work, and it looks like this is the reason why. If you look at the value of real estate owned, that means the value of his land property was $8,000, which is quite a lot for 1870. And the value of his personal estate, which means his possessions, his home, the things in the home, things that can be moved, was valued at $800. So that's pretty wealthy. It's important to note that if somebody does have this column, value of real estate, filled out, that means that they have a land record somewhere that could be useful for future research. It'll tell you this great information about where their parents were born. So she was born in England, so her parents were of foreign birth as well. So we know that she immigrated at some point, and there's a reason to look for a naturalization record or an immigration record. It'll tell you if they were born within the year and what month they were, or if they were married within the year and what month they were married, if they attended school. It'll tell you if they can't read or write. So this man from Mexico can't read or write. That might just mean he can't read or write in English, but that's something to take note of. And it says male citizen of the US of 21 years or age. So that means this man from Mexico is considered a citizen and he is allowed to vote. So that's good reason to look for a naturalization record. And if they aren't able to vote, it'll note the reason why. So pay attention to all the columns in a census and look for what information that can give to you and help point you to other records. The next set of records is the next area of censuses would be the 1880 to the 1940 census. These ones are far more detailed. This is the 1940 census. So they list relationships and more specifics about the family. It is important to remember that the 1890 census, it caught on fire in the 1920s. And so half of it was destroyed. And then when Congress saw that, they're like, what good is half a census? So they destroyed the other half. So there are very, very few copies of the 1890 census. So it's not even really worth looking for your family in the 1890 census. So don't be alarmed if you're looking for every 10 years. And then all of a sudden there's this 20-year gap where the 1890 census is missing. That's because it probably doesn't exist. The 1900 and the 1910 census include a column that lists the number of children a woman has had and the number of children that are living. So that's really useful. Pay attention to the 1900 and the 1910 census for that information. I have found many a missing child that way. 1900 has more specifics on birth dates and birth months. And all of the censuses from 1880 on have more information about citizenship and veteran status. So again, pay attention to all the columns that a census might have. Pay attention to the little numbers that are included there as well. There's a website. These numbers might seem useful. They're just census codes. But let's look at this right here. This is this woman's occupation. And it says clerk. And then it has I have a hard time reading that word. So I want to know what that word is. I can't really read it, but if I pay attention to this code right here, that code is going to be able to help me out. And if you go to 1940 census, you just Google 1940 census codes, and you scroll down, there's this website called stevemorse.org. And what it has is all of the codes in the censuses, and you can fill it out and it'll tell you that information. So if I go to occupation code and I put in that information, so let's see, we have 266,98,2. So we go 266,98,2. So it says she was a clerk for a state and local government, and she is a government worker. So that helps me get a little more information that I'm not entirely sure what that is saying because the handwriting is bad. So pay attention to those codes and go to stevemorse.org if you want to decipher those codes a little bit better. Before we end, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how censuses were taken. Censuses are not perfect. So if you find an ancestor in there and their name is misspelled or their age is different, you have to remember that the census is only as good as the person who wrote it down and as good as the person who gave that information. So a census taker would go door to door with his notepad usually. He wouldn't take the census forms because they were too big. And he'd go door to door, and whoever answered the door, he would say, who lives here? And he would ask all those questions. Now, sometimes mom and dad weren't home, and it was the kid, the 5-year-old, who was providing all the information. Or sometimes nobody was home, and it was the neighbor who was providing the information. Sometimes the person who was at the door had an accent, and it was hard to understand them. Especially if you have an uncommon last name, it can be hard to find or for the census taker to record that name spelling correctly. So pay attention. It's okay if there's some errors in the census. A lot of times it's just the informant who just doesn't know. Sometimes people have accents. Sometimes people just lied. Censuses aren't perfect. They're just meant to be a snapshot of your family in a year that they lived in a place. There are also different types of censuses. There's slave censuses or slave schedules. Those were only taken in 1850 and 1860, and unfortunately it does not include the names of the slaves, but it can be used as a useful tool for tracking your family members if you have African American ancestry. There's also agricultural censuses that were taken between 1850 and 1885, and that just records property. They're not super useful genealogically. The most useful ones genealogically are going to be the mortality schedule, which is a census that took record of everybody who died the year before the census was taken, and it will list the cause. So it's an alternative for a death certificate. And those were taken in 1850 through 1880 about. Again, every 10 years. So if your ancestor died on a decade, then it might be worth looking for the mortality schedule for them. And then also the veterans schedule. And the veterans schedule was taken in 1890, and it kind of substitutes the missing 1890 census. So if you had an ancestor who served in the Civil War or in the Spanish-American War or some of those earlier to mid-1800 wars, then they might be included in that 1890 veterans census. Well, that's all we have for today. And feel free to message me or email me if you have any questions about vital records and census records. And happy sleuthing.